So, as I say, I was in the Korean War. Maybe I'll tell you a war story, not an army story. I got drafted in the old days. Nowadays it's a volunteer army, and those young men, I just admire them because they want to go to war. I didn't want to go to war. I was going to college. I wanted to stay in college. I had a girlfriend. I didn't want to go in the army. But I got deferred until I graduated. I graduated in May, and by October I was in the Army. And I ended up in the infantry. Now, I don't know if you know what the infantry is, but that's a foot soldier. The fellow said, I had an officer, his name was Fleming, came from Quincy. And he said, remember this, you will never have to apologize for having served in the infantry. You'll meet guys who have been radio men, have been medics, that's all important, but the wars are won by an infantryman. So this was during the Korean War, which would be, this was in 1953, 52, 53, 54, and so forth. It started in 50, but by the time I got there, it was 53, 54. 53, the truce was signed, which is still in effect now. Here it is 67 years later, still in effect. But I guess it's kind of shaky. You're hearing a lot about North Korea. Those are the same people we were fighting against 60 years ago. Well, anyway, I got drafted. Went down to City Hall in Taunton, if you know where that is. They're going to rebuild the building. But anyway, we got down there, and let's see, there was Frank Tosti and Jack Kearns and Marty Newfield, John Pereira, a young man named Henshaw, I don't know what his first name was, and me. And we're all standing there wondering what's next, and the mayor came down to speak to us. The mayor at that time was Johnny Parker. He ended up being a senator, but then he was the mayor. And he gave us all one of these brand new, newfangled ink pens called a ballpoint pen. They were brand new, didn't have to have any ink or anything. And the reason he gave us the ink pen, and he said, now listen, when you get into the Army, no matter where you are, I want you to write your mother a letter. And every so often write her a letter, because if you don't, she'll be calling me at 2 o'clock in the morning, wanting to know why Johnny doesn't write anymore. So anyway, we got the new pen, and in those days, you didn't have any say as to where you wanted to go or what kind of service you wanted. They told you where you would go. As I say, you ended up in the infantry. My cousin, John, was in the Second World War, and he was sent to England. And he said to me before I left, he said, don't worry, John, you won't see any action. For every man who sees action, there are 7 men supporting him, and supply and medics and whatever. So chances of you seeing any action are nil. Well, I got on the boat, Seattle, Washington, went to Yokohama, Japan. Had there a couple of days, and they called me out. They're going to send me to school. They're going to I'm not going to be on the front lines. They're going to send me to school. So, turns out, at that time, the enemy there was some feeling that they may use poisonous gas like they did in the First World War, or biological. So anyway, they sent me to this school called CBR School, Chemical, Biological, and Radiological Warfare. Radiological be radar, not radar, but radium. You had to have a Geiger counter and all that stuff. So I went to the school, and it was only 2 weeks, but it was at a place called Etajima. If you look that up on Google, it's a little island off the coast of Tokyo. And at one time, it was the Naval Academy for Japan. I don't know what it is now. But anyway, I was there for 2 weeks. Got back on a boat again and went to Busan, Korea. At the time, Busan, Korea was a shambles. All the buildings were destroyed. What they had for shelter was made out of sea ration boxes. Sea ration, that's combat food for soldiers. But these were empty boxes, and they used it to cover up what little building they had. Now, if you look at Busan, South Korea, it's a mammoth shipbuilding city. Huge, huge ships are built there. But at the time, there was nothing there but sea ration boxes. I got on the train and headed north to where the fighting was going on. And it was an old-fashioned steam engine, the kind of chug, 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 chug. And it was dragging us up over the mountains, and the wheels were slipping on the tracks. So the engineer had to get out of the cab and put sand under the wheels so they would grab and cause friction, and the thing would go along. Now, for some reason or other, we all know we're going up to the front line. We all have the rifles, but they didn't give us any ammunition. Well, that's kind of strange, isn't it? You got a rifle but no bullets. What good is it? Why? And they wouldn't tell us why they didn't give us any bullets. So I think the reason they didn't give us any bullets was so we wouldn't shoot at each other. Because this is a spooky business. You know, guys say didn't bother them at all. Well, it bothered me, and I was frightened. It was no fun. On the way up, we stopped. I've forgotten the name of the town. Where we stopped at one place and stayed overnight. We're all sleeping in a big tent. 3 o'clock in the morning, we hear like a police whistle blowing. Jeez, we all woke up. What is this? The guy come in, he says, the North Koreans have just parachuted down and we're surrounded by North Koreans. There we are, we got the rifles, we got no bullets. Then they were just laughing. They said, well, they were only fooling. We're only kidding. Of course, we could have strangled them all, but I don't know how many guys they did that to, but it certainly was a mean thing to do. Talk about bullying. Well, anyway, eventually I got up to the front line. And at the time, the enemy was experimenting with psychological warfare. They had big speakers set up. See, it was a trench-type warfare. There was our side, and there was their side. And in between was what they call no man's land. How wide no man's land is, well, depending on the valley and so forth. You know, it might be 100 yards wide or might be a mile wide, depending on the location. Well, anyway, we were set up in our trench, and they had their trench, and that, as they say, psychological warfare. And what it was they had big speakers set up, pointed towards us, and they had American women singing. One of them was Rosemary Clooney singing "How Much Is the Doggy in the Window?" That's all to get you thinking about home and to get your mind off Hawaii, that kind of stuff. So anyway, this Rosemary Clooney is singing, "How much is the doggy in the window? The one with the waggly tail." Well, when we heard that right away, we started thinking about home. So I was telling that story at a nursing home, and a woman jumped up and said, "That wasn't Rosemary Clooney, it was Patsy Cline." She was about 90 years old. So you can see she was right with me in that story all along. Anyway, I got there, and my first meal on the front, they call it the MLR, Main Line of Resistance. You might see that nowadays. And anyway, my first meal, I was late getting there. They had already served supper. And so I went, my captain said, "Go to the cook's and see what he can give you for something to eat." The only thing that was left was beans and prunes. So that's what I had for my first meal. Well, people always ask me, "Did you shoot anybody?" No. The closest I got to shooting anyone was we were on patrol one night, and we had just spent the whole night sitting in a rice paddy where the water was up to here, and we could hear someone walking around, someone coming. And see, in those days, they didn't have cell phones like we have now. They had what they call a sound power telephone. What it is a wire and a 6-volt battery and a handset. In order to get the attention of the people back in the what do you call it, outpost, you have to blow into the transmitter, and it would whistle on the other end, and then you could talk to the people. And we grabbed a hold of that sound power telephone, blew into the transmitter, and they answered, of course. We said, "We hear footsteps approaching," and we were about to shoot who was coming along. We hear footsteps approaching, and it turns out it was a patrol coming back in, but they got lost and didn't come back in where they were supposed to. They came in where we were. We damn near killed a whole bunch of them. So that was the closest I got, and that was close enough for me. Eventually, the truce is signed. I was on the line of resistance when they signed the truce. And we had received word that the truce was going to be signed in the morning, and then the fighting would stop at 10 o'clock at night. So all day long, bombarding back and forth, boom, 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 and then nighttime, and flares would go up in the air. They had flares that went up, and then they burst into brilliant white light that lit up the whole place. You could see everything. And I said to the guy next to me, "No way are they going to stop this thing at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock came, and it stopped. The whole thing stopped. You could hear a pin drop. And now we all thought, "Whoa, boy, we're going to go home." No. We had to stay another 18 months before we could come home. But eventually that time came and got on the boat. And I didn't have a scratch on me. Made it through without any injury, although I saw a lot of people who didn't make it back. Anyway, I came back and got discharged and went on with life after that. This is one of my original stories, and it goes something like this. It's a Bridgewater kind of a day, my mother would say. It's a Bridgewater kind of a day, which meant we were going to have to go to Bridgewater. My sister and I was about 10, she was 11. My parents. You see, it wasn't unusual when we were kids that a man might have a driver's license, but not own an automobile. And as such was the case with my father. He had a license, but he didn't have an automobile. But the people next door had an automobile and nobody to drive it. Because the man who owned that, well, they say he fell out of a window and died. Well, this was during the Depression. He probably jumped out the window, lost all his fortune or whatever. Well, anyway, every once in a while I'd say to my father, why don't you take the kids out for a ride? And it's good to drive the car every once in a while. So he'd go over and get the car. It was a 1927 Erskine. They don't make them anymore. An Erskine was a modern-day car, had an air-cooled engine. That was unheard of, an air-cooled engine. Of course, Volkswagen came out with it later. Well, anyway, I just want to describe the car to you. It was a big car. Of course, as a kid, it was enormous. It was long and had big clamshell fenders, had a big steering gear coming up out of the floor, gear shift, chrome it was. Had a rosewood dash with the knobs and all the gauges on it and everything. Had a trunk on the back, and it was a real trunk, a leather trunk, held on with big leather straps. My mother and father sat in the front. My sister and I sat in the back. The back window had a shade in the back window. You with a shade like you have in the house. Had a little bobble hanging there, and as you go along, it would swing back and forth. Now, we lived in Taunton at the time, and Bridgewater is probably about 8 to 10 miles from Taunton to Bridgewater. And if it was on a Sunday afternoon, it usually was a Sunday afternoon, we'd go up Somerset Avenue, and the train crossed Somerset Avenue, and it was 3 o'clock Sunday afternoon. The weekend freight was going by, and that was a huge, I don't know, I don't think it was 100 cars, but 50 anyway. And we'd get out of the car because the traffic was stopped, waiting for the train to go by, and we'd go over and stand by the track as the train went by and would wave to the man driving the train. And if he was a friendly guy, he'd blow the whistle as he went by. And we came, after the train went by, went up center of town, past what do you call it? The Common, they call it in Taunton. I don't know what they call it in Providence, but we call it the Common. And go up Broadway and go past St. Mary's School, where I went to school, and further up Broadway, past the midget gas station. There were 2 little midgets that ran the gas station. Then about 3 feet high. And they would, well, if you pulled in there to get gas, they'd come out with a step ladder. Climb up the step ladder, lean over, open up the hood, check the oil, wash the windows, make sure you had air in the tire. I know, all around. Plus, pump the gas. Of course, gas was only about 15 cents a gallon then. Well, we'd get the gas, and then we'd get back in the car and go up. My father would say, now pay attention, kids. You're going to see something that you've never seen before. Wow. What could that be, something we've never seen before? We were 10 or 11 years old. We've seen about everything. Well, we got up in Raynham and went by the auto theater. You could drive your car right in and watch the movies. That's where Market Basket is now. Well, anyway, we'd go along a little further, and sure enough, we got up to the milk bottle. Did you ever go to the milk bottle? It's up on Broadway. The milk bottle, it's still there. And in those days, there wasn't a restaurant, there was just ice cream. And my father would tell us to go get the ice cream, stand in line, and they'd play on a Sunday afternoon. The line was down here all around, lots of people. My mother and father never got ice cream. We just the kids got ice cream. And I figured that they probably couldn't afford ice cream for themselves, but they could for the kids. And I'd say to him, gee, Dad, why don't you get some ice cream? And he'd say, no, I don't feel like ice cream. I just like to watch you kids eat it, enjoy it. And so we'd sit on the running board and eat that ice cream. And then he said, if you behave yourself, I'm going to take you to your next favorite place. The next place was the duck farm. The duck farm. You know, in those days, in Raynham, they had several duck farms, and they raised 1 million ducks a year. Of course, they all ended up on somebody's dinner table, but when we saw them, they were all little bitty ducks. Well, that's my story for Sunday afternoon. And that's the way it was 70 years ago, maybe 80 years, I'll say 80 years ago.